Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here at Cardiff. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be invited. It's been very stimulating couple of days for me, and very nice to be in a kind of all-nuclear environment, as it were. Quite a lot of the time, I'm justifying my work to other governmental scientists and other people from different perspectives. So it's nice to have something focused directly on my area of empirical research. So yes, hopefully I'm going to add something to the proceedings that we haven't seen. I'm using a political discourse theory perspective. So this is a qualitative perspective, and we've seen over the past couple of days, past few sessions, some very nice statistical analysis, some very nice polling analysis, broad-based statistical picture of where nuclear stands in various different contexts. I'm specifically going to talk about the UK context. This has been the focus of my PhD and policy change in the UK. But yeah, hopefully I'm going to supplement some of these analyses that we've seen with a kind of approach to the nitty-gritty of the politics of nuclear power. So first of all, I'll say a little something about political discourse theory, because certainly my perspective on it is that it's slightly marginalised, not very well known. Specifically the type I do, which is specific to the University of Essex. So yeah, I'll just give you a little introduction to it. Political discourse theory kind of starts from the premise that everything is political and everything is discursive. This means that we have to wonder why some things are more important than others on political agendas. Now, this is done through three types of logic, or political logic, discursive logic. So the first type, social logics, are essentially practices and signifiers that are depoliticized. So in the case of energy policy and energy use, we might think of turning on a light switch is essentially a depoliticized action. You turn on a light switch, and hopefully if your light bulb hasn't blown or you've paid your electricity bill, the light comes on, using any kind of application, any kind of application of electricity usually has that connotation. Political logics are the way in which discursive signifiers and objects are interpolated, essentially, and become either depoliticized or politicized, right? So this is done through what is called a logic of equivalence and difference. This is essentially drawing lines around things, creating inside groups and outside groups. And so the practice of politics is essentially deciding what we want to hold constant and deciding what we want to change, and problematizing the things that we want to change, and deproblematizing, depoliticizing the things we want to keep the same. This takes place in a context generally of what is described in the theory as dislocation. And this is usually some kind of event that needs interpretation. So we've seen, for example, that we might think the Fukushima accident, for example, is a prime example of a kind of dislocated, possible dislocation of nuclear power. But as I'm hopefully going to show, events don't interpret themselves. They require political interpretation. So hopefully this is going to go some way to explain, or at least provide some kind of interpretation of Wouter's findings that there's a sharp decrease in support for nuclear power in the UK post-Fukushima, and then very quickly a tick back upwards. And hopefully I'm going to provide some kind of interpretation of why that might be. The final part of political discourse theory is what are termed phantasmatic logics. And these are essentially the way in which discourses grip subjects, why subjects care about them. So this is usually emotive and normative content. And very simply, this can be through the construction of what are termed their beatific and horrific images. So nightmare visions or utopian visions provide the kind of emotive grip that mean subjects want to actually be involved in political projects. So in the case of certain aspects of green discourse, for example, it might be that there's a kind of green self-sufficient utopia where we're not harming the environment, we're living in harmony with it. By contrast, there may be technical utopia images as well of increased scientific control, and to the extent that human beings can live fantastic lives, right? But usually these are coupled with the nightmare vision of the alternative. So from green discourse, we might say, okay, on the one hand, we can have this wonderful green utopia where we're living in harmony, and the alternative is a terrible dystopia where, essentially something like some of the films we've seen about climate change, right? Nature rising up against humanity and destroying it in some way. But obviously there are various ways this can be done. So political discourse theory generally says that the content of these things can be just empirically looked at. We don't want to a priori say we expect a certain thing to exist. So I think that's enough about this kind of theory. It's usually the best way with sort of post-structuralist theory to get the theory out of the way early and then ignore it for a little while and come back to it in the conclusion. So I have two focal points that I'm going to try and aim at in this presentation. So the first is how is the Fukushima accident dealt with discursively? And this is, again, in the UK. And like I say, hopefully this is going to provide some kind of political interpretation of what was going on in 2011 in the UK and how such an apparently, on the face of it, an event that would provide a dislocation to nuclear power in the UK ended up not doing so. And then secondly, I'm also going to spend a little time, very little time, comparing some of the response to Fukushima with some of the responses to other nuclear accidents, specifically 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. So yeah, secondly, I'm going to try and examine why there is a governmental preference against changing this policy. So hopefully in the first half of the talk I show you how it was done, but then the question remains, okay, why does the government retain this preference for nuclear power in the first place? Why should the government want to deal with the accident in this way, rather than deciding to change its policy, right? There was a multi-pronged strategy in place following the Fukushima accident in the UK. And so here we are focusing primarily on political logics, okay? So creating in-groups and out-groups and equivalence and difference. And one of the most important ways of dealing with the accident was distancing the industry from the problematic reactor. Now this has been the case in other accidents as well. So the aim is actually almost to set up, if you remember Nick Pidgeon's Swiss cheese model yesterday, the aim is to try and put some cheese in the way of the holes of the other slices of the Swiss cheese, right? And distance the industry from the problematic reactor. So this was done partly by talking about the age of the design. So the quote there is from George Monbiot in The Guardian, very shortly afterwards. He's a crucial figure in this, as he's a very prominent green journalist, very kind of well respected in the green industry, in the green movement. And very shortly after Fukushima happened, he came out and said, Fukushima has changed my mind on nuclear, I now support it. And here's why. And so, yes, his quote is that it was a crappy old plant with inadequate safety features, as he puts it. With the implication that we've learnt from the designs we've done in the 60s and 70s, and now they're better. And so we can dismiss this reactor as problematizing the whole industry because the industry has moved on. So we shouldn't be held hostage to this accident. This was coupled actually with another approach of the idea that the reactors were holding up well in spite of this age. So, as we've seen, much was made of the idea that there were no lethal doses of radiation. Nobody actually died from radiation poisoning. There was also a move to kind of focus on the plant to obscure the safety efforts that make the relatively benign, in terms of death, outcome of the actual nuclear accident, that actually obscures the reasons why that might not have occurred, notwithstanding Malcolm's objection that evacuation is a dangerous process, indeed. There was also a very interesting use of an argument of bad taste. So it was put in various different publications. There was particularly one in the Telegraph and also, I think, in the Register, the internet technical newspaper, that focusing on the nuclear aspect of the accident, of the earthquake, was actually in bad taste, because so many people had died from a tsunami and an earthquake at the time, and no one had actually died from the nuclear accident. Spending so much ink and internet print, I don't know what the equivalent would be, in discussing the nuclear situation was actually in poor taste, and the focus should have been on the victim's suffering, as is often the case, as Karin was showing. Actually, maybe not so much the case in the international news media. It was also an attempt to bring victory from defeat, and as I've kind of mentioned, George Monbiot, this was a prime example of this form of argumentation. So it was actually that the old plant was surviving in the face of unforeseen adversity. So it's a kind of, as we've seen earlier, act of God argument. There was an act of God going on. Who could possibly know that such a terrible event would happen? And even when it has happened, and even when it's happened to a plant that was designed very early on and is not very good, it has still survived. I mean, this is very early on. This is within 3 days of the earthquake. And of course, the implication is that, and it's a fairly convincing argument, that Britain generally doesn't face tsunamis and massive earthquakes, so what do we have to worry about? It's a peculiarly Japanese problem. So the aim then is to show Fukushima actually as a triumph for nuclear. Instead of it being this, so we'd expect there to be some kind of dislocation just on the face of the idea that accidents look bad for the nuclear industry. But the approach was to reverse that, actually reverse the discourse and say, no, well, far from showing that it's a terrible event for nuclear, it shows how safe the nuclear industry is, because nobody's died of a lethal dose of radiation and so forth. And as I've said before, yes, George Monbiot is important for this. He's a key green actor. But it's also important to note that this multi-pronged strategy was agreed at the governmental level. There was a strong element of coordination between government and the nuclear industry. And the Guardian did a Freedom of Information request and got a load of emails showing that one particular civil servant, very shortly after the accident was making news, said, "Okay, we need to take the ground and hold it from the nuclear chaps and chapesses," in a very British sort of civil service way, very Sir Humphrey. And this went round to Aviva and EDF and Westinghouse and so on and so forth. And this strategy was agreed across it. You can see in the emails that they say, okay, this is how we should do it. I think we should say, actually, it's holding up very well. So we can actually draw these things from these emails and then go back to the media reporting and see how well it translates across. And it translates across fantastically well. It's very, very obvious that the two are connected. And I've said there, actually, so it aims at showing Fukushima as a triumph for nuclear. I've said it's actually a triumph for the emergency services, but we could say something more broad than that, and this is always what we try and do in discourse theory. You try and take a sort of big picture if we possibly can. And we might actually say that it's more a triumph for the kind of surrounding social settlement to nuclear as a technology. So again, with a Swiss cheese model, we have the nuclear part of society failing, but the other parts surrounding it actually come in and help deal with the problem. So yes, as I've kind of alluded to in the previous slide, there was a high level of coordination between industry and government. Analogies with war were very common in the emails, taking the ground and holding it, and taking the fight to the green camp and things like that were all used as kind of analogies, metaphors. And this highly contrasts with, in particular, 3 Mile Island. From my kind of research on the response to the governmental and industry responses to 3 Mile Island, particularly in America, there were multiple competing expert views. There was no centralized coordination between actors. Government was saying one thing, industry was saying another, managers were saying yet another thing. There was even confusion over evacuation. Who should be evacuated? Should it just be children, pregnant women, and so forth? And once you get the sort of ABC American coverage of it, lots of vox pop pieces to camera where they are talking to people who say, I don't know what is going on. I'm panicking, so I'm just going to evacuate myself, which is kind of not a very good bit of risk communication, as it were, as we've seen from yesterday. So, if anything, the nuclear industry has definitely learned how to deal with accidents in a public response, at least in Britain. I mean, we've seen that maybe TEPCO and the Japanese government's response was far less adequate in that regard. But then I suppose they were under a lot more pressure. So we also saw, deferral of requests for comments to industry bodies. So industry bodies like the NIA become very important here. And this prevents connection with company brands. There's some email evidence where someone from Westinghouse is saying, if we keep on being asked for comment, but we're going to refer everything to the industry body because the last thing we need is Westinghouse's name being put anywhere near this accident. So ultimately, the move is to say it's, in the long run this is, so initially the move is to say we distance ourselves from the reactor, but we also say that it's holding up surprisingly well. And then when it turns out that it's not holding up that well, we get to December and it's only just being stabilized, ultimately it's a move to say it's the operator's fault and it's the design of the plant. And as we've seen, there's quite a lot of truth in this. Putting your spent fuel rods near your reactor and things like that, not excellent ideas. So on the one hand, it's still this unforeseen circumstance to a certain extent, but it's also failure to plan for unforeseen circumstances and failure to run properly the plant. So this is a move that others the offending reactor. So you push the reactor away from the industry and the broader political project is safe. You lose one slice of Swiss cheese, but you keep the rest of the block, as it were. And this occurred very much with Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island as well. And this is from a kind of Western perspective on both of these. And I'll talk a little bit about specifically British. But for Chernobyl, it was relatively easy to other the offending reactor because you could talk about communism, right? And you could basically say, communists don't know how to run this technology. They have a terrible idea about safety, which has quite a bit of truth to it. And actually, the initial report from the Soviets blamed operators very strongly. It's only after the Soviet Union collapses in 1991 that it's then revised to say, okay, it's a general culture that we had in communism and that was really bad. But initially it was a move to simply blame people on the ground at the time doing a foolish procedure. But in the West, of course, you could just say, well, it's communist and we have better designs. For 3 Mile Island, that's slightly more problematic because, of course, it's a Western reactor, it's an American reactor. Now, in America, in the initial report, government report into the accident 6 months after it, there was quite a bit about industry culture being poor, and as we've seen about sort of socio-technical complex systems, that actually sort of feeds into that idea quite well. And there was also some blaming of operators. But it was also very interesting, and I'll just say maybe a quick word about a particular construction that's very interesting in that report, which is that the design of nuclear power is kind of, I don't know what the word would be, valorized, I suppose. The design doesn't have designers in the report. The design exists, and then people use it. And human error equals operator error. So designers essentially, we can maybe take from that, aren't human. They're essentially, designing, in the royal sense of designing, or in the biblical sense of designing, perhaps. And from a British perspective, 3 Mile Island was a fascinating way of responding to it, because at the time Britain had a nationalised nuclear industry that on and off was attempting to prevent American reactors coming into the UK. So it was possible to argue that 3 Mile Island happened because the American industry was too capitalist, in the sense that it was too focused on profit and not focused enough on safety. Whereas Britain, with a nationalised industry, was able to focus on safety. And quite a lot of the arguments when they were pushing forward the advanced gas reactors in comparison to pressurised water reactors was they're not pressurised, they're more inherently safe, so they're worth a bit more money than the American one. It's fine to spend a bit more money. While simultaneously, of course, saying that you wouldn't have to spend more money. Such is politics. Fukushima, as we can see, is a more advanced strategy than either of these. It's not just othering a reactor and abandoning it and saying, well, it's the fault of the people who are running it or their particular culture. In fact, of course, we see with Fukushima that in some of the media reports that it's considered as a very Japanese accident, which is a similar kind of move. But it's a more advanced strategy because it is also shifting to the opposite extreme. It's the claim to make it as a victory. So there's a dual kind of almost paradoxical move where both these things are occurring simultaneously. So, as I say, yeah, ultimately this is protecting the broader political project by abandoning smaller elements of that project. So reactors are smaller elements of a larger nuclear industry. So, yeah, just before I move on to the second half, I'll take a little sip of water. So if we know, broadly speaking, or at least I've provided an interpretation, how government and industry tried to deal with this accident, we should reasonably ask, why would the government want to do so? And I should say at this point as well that because everything is discursive and political in political discourse theory, which means you can talk about any subject you like, and lots of people do, whether they know anything about it or not, it's very important to note that all actors are considered to be engaging in political activity. So in this section I'm going to discuss how we got to having nuclear power policy in the UK, where we wanted to build more reactors. But it's important to bear in mind that people promoting renewable energy, people promoting coal, gas, and so forth, anyone with any kind of skin in this game is going to be acting strategically and trying to further their interests. So essentially, Malcolm, don't take this personally. Changing minds on nuclear took a lot of time. This is my doctoral work, which I'm submitting next week, actually. So I'm kind of skiving off here, but so from 2003 to 2006, there was a very strong campaign centered around the group supporters of nuclear energy, which Malcolm is a member of, or at least he was for many years. Whether he still is now, I don't know, but maybe he can tell us. Directly after this 2003 white paper, in 2003 we had a white paper in the UK which said, we don't want any nuclear power, please. Ideally, we'd like more renewables. Now, it was a very lukewarm set of proposals, and one of the things I do in my doctoral work is look at why that might have been the case. And one of the reasons, I think, is that the renewables lobby didn't really put forward a very convincing argument that government could be convinced by that renewables could provide the kind of scale to deal with their projected energy demand. But directly after this white paper, when the media were reporting kind of the death knell of the nuclear industry in the UK, so the supporters of nuclear energy get a tip-off from a Labour MP, according to their newsletter, who says, if you want to get any new nuclear power in the UK ever again, you have to start talking about climate change. This is initially met with scepticism in this group. Bernard Ingham is the secretary of this group. He is a fairly prominent climate skeptic. He is strongly pro-nuclear, strongly anti-renewables. And so his initial response to this is that this is disingenuous nonsense, is what he says. We shouldn't do this. But the very next month, he's working out how they can do this in their newsletter. So he's nothing if not a practical man. And you don't get to be Margaret Thatcher's press secretary by not having some kind of political nous, right? So climate change has to be used to overcome privatization. In my doctoral work, I put forward the idea that privatization of the energy market in the UK was the crucial kind of thing that knocked nuclear on the head. Since 1995, no investment. Since 1989, really, no investment. And basically, no privatized companies wanted to spend any money on it. But they also they have a 6-point strategy. I won't go through all 6 points here, but one of the moves is to drop their objection to renewables and say, on the whole, actually, we're not against renewables. We don't think they're very good, but if you want to spend money and do them, that's fine. But you should realize that you can't do everything you want to do with renewables alone. That's just not going to happen. And so this signifier of a balanced energy mix comes through. And what a balanced energy mix does, of course, is that it says things that are in the balanced energy mix are sensible, and people who are criticizing things that are in the balanced energy mix are not sensible. They're unreasonable, essentially. So it allows you to paint particularly green people who are against nuclear power, because a lot of them are, as completely unreasonable. All they want is a renewables future. That's not a balanced energy mix. And this was very effective. In fact, this helped frame the 2006 consultation. And so very early on, actually, it's very interesting that supporters of nuclear energy have what is described as a chairman's lunch with Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, presumably asking them whether they want to support this campaign. And Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth say, thanks for the lunch, but no thanks. So the main kind of influence of this group is their influential members. They don't have very much money. They don't, they're not like Greenpeace, where Greenpeace have lots of members and lots of churn of members and multi-million pounds, and that's how they run. They have instead very useful Rolodexes, very good address books. Crucially, James Lovelock is a member of this group. He's been a member of this group for a very long time. This was not reported when he was kind of portrayed as this green Damascene conversion kind of guy. He's this wonderful green theorist, and now he's saying it's nuclear power and this is all a big shock. Actually, it's not. He thought of this for a long time. And his article in 2004 that kind of kick-starts this whole debate follows Soane's 6-point strategy to 5 of its points, and the only one it doesn't mention is cost, which is basically the weakest argument for nuclear. So he's an influential member, Bernard Ingham, as I've mentioned. Jack Cunningham, this is the former Labour MP. Lord McAlpine is a construction magnate. Various BNFL and Nuclear Industry Association high-ranking officials are in this group. Keith Parker is a member of this group, who's the chair, I think it is, of the NIA. So their importance is their influence. And why is there's some kind of confusion and nebulous nature, I should say at this point, in policy analysis of what the state is. We'd like to think that groups in civil society set out to convince the state, as it were. But what this case kind of shows to me is that it's far more complicated than that. So we see a member of the government, so the Labour Party historically has had a pro-nuclear wing and an anti-nuclear wing. And for various reasons, good socialist reasons, one might say, in the 70s and 80s. They quite liked nuclear power because of the importance of unions, the importance of undermining the coal union and getting a bit more power back to the central government, but also because of the promise of economic growth and technical growth, and that's been a strong theme in socialism anyway. So both socialism and capitalism are pro-growth in that sense. But yeah, so it's fascinating to me anyway that it doesn't seem to be so much about convincing different members of the state, although that's important, but it's also about where it is we think the line is being drawn between state and civil society. So again, it's back to political logics of equivalence and difference. Rather than going, this institution or that institution is part of the state and these ones are not, it's far more productive to say, why is this line being drawn in a certain way and where is it being drawn? So in the case of Soane, it gets very interesting because, of course, they're doing the work for a Labour MP who wants nuclear power to occur. There are lots of various different people who want nuclear power to occur. And what they do, I argue, is set the political context in which a decision for nuclear power can be made. It's quite likely that Tony Blair was pro-nuclear prior to 2003. Certainly when they had the 2003 white paper come through, Brian Wilson was in charge of it, and he is pro-nuclear. But shortly after that, Tony Blair starts saying in public, I have fought long and hard to keep this option on the table. So this gives us an interesting idea about political power, right? If the Prime Minister of the country wants to make a decision, it isn't simply that he makes the decision and things happen, although that can occur. Even the Prime Minister has to be concerned about, and certainly Tony Blair was a master of being concerned about public opinion and whether he's going to win an election. But anyway, sure. So to return to why government might protect nuclear, crucial, I think, and I think what the 2003 white paper did not do, is protection of social logic, so protection of current ways of life, current ways of interpolation of humans within the electrical system, basically. And that's not adequately done by the 2003 white paper. I think it doesn't convince people who are highly worried about meeting demand. But it's also, having done that and having done this work, we've seen this supportive nuclear energy work has been done. If we get to Fukushima and we see there's a large accident, this is 2003 to 2006. We've had this changing of minds, and we've seen it in the polling data. Once we get to 2011, lots of other political work has been done. Sites, licensing, planning battles, concerns over waste have tried to be dealt with. And so there's a lot of sunk costs, as it were, sunk political costs that need to be protected. So that's one thing. But it's also crucial to note that saying no to nuclear after this accident actually means going back to the drawing board on energy policy. It blows a massive hole in government energy policy because they're hoping to have essentially a third nuclear, a third renewables, a third, well, gas, broadly speaking. So that's a huge political cost. If you abandon that, suddenly you're open to all sorts of accusations that you don't know what you're doing on energy policy, your energy policy is in disarray, what are you going to do about energy policy and so forth. So it's important to protect that. Really, the place of nuclear in energy policy comes into an idea about politics of unsustainability. This is a concept from a professor at Bath in Gulf of Bluton, which is a very good concept, I think, which is essentially that what we intend to do with most of our responses to sustainability problems is maintain lifestyles sans carbon. So it's about reducing sustainability down to, and this is done in the policy documents, by the way, from 2003, there's a wide definition of sustainability. 2006, it is carbon emissions that equals sustainability. So once we reduce sustainability and green politics down to carbon, nuclear starts to make more sense. And the 2003 white paper tried to do this, and the nuclear guys were able to capitalize on this. Demand is depoliticized, so lifestyles are depoliticized. So once we say we expect demand to rise and we expect demand to be this, and we don't say, why is it we demand this much electricity in the first place, and maybe we shouldn't, which would be a green response, this produces the there is no alternative argument. We have this much demand, we must meet it somehow. How are we going to meet it? The same argument occurs with the expansion of Heathrow as well. We're going to expand the number of passengers exponentially. How are we going to meet this demand? We're just going to have if we don't expand our airports, we're going to have congestion. It's going to be terrible. Whether these demand projections are any good or not is always a political and a technical question. So what we see is phantasmatic logics and social logics working together. The loss of current social logics is the horrific image, right? The idea that the lifestyle you have now will not work is used very effectively, in fact, in a 2004 BBC special called If the Lights Go Out, in which a fictional minister says the immortal words, I never thought I'd say this, but come back nuclear power, all is forgiven. And so we see this is the phantasmatic logic. The lights are out, the minister is facing death threats. What a disaster, right? So the social logics and the phantasmatic logics work together there. So yeah, to quickly answer our questions that we set up, the Fukushima accident is dealt with in the UK by distancing the reactor from the wider industry, by saying it's an old, weak design, it's down to TEPCO errors, it's down to an act of God, but also simultaneously claiming a victory for the wider industry. No radiation deaths, despite the fact that it's an old design under intense pressure. And so we have seen the political logics of equivalence and difference there at work. We've also seen why, hopefully, an interpretation at least of why the nuclear industry might be protected. It's because there's lots of sunk political costs. Gaining public acceptance took quite a while. We can see Reuters polls as they slowly climb their way up. Plus, the ancillary work of enacting policy is also a political cost. And we also can say that we have nuclear in the first place because of an idea of politics of unsustainability. We want to depoliticize lifestyles, and we want to have technological optimism. This can often be considered an ideology of ecological modernization. This is a kind of separate topic, perhaps. So the phantasmatic and social logics work together to produce the idea that there is no alternative. So thank you very much for listening.